1. Intro. She didn't know his name when she leaned over the stretcher, only that the man was fading fast. The monitors were screaming, the room was chaos, but her voice stayed steady as she pressed her hands to his chest. And then, through cracked lips, he whispered the words that froze her, "Please don't let me die alone." Emily didn't know why that plea hit so deep. Maybe because she, too, knew what it felt like to be left. Hours later, when he finally opened his eyes, the world seemed to settle. He looked at her as if she was the first safe thing he'd seen in years, and she had no idea this man, this stranger, would be the one to break her more than anyone ever had. Before we continue, hit subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Stories like this deserve to be heard all the way through. 2. The rescue. Emily worked through the night, her hands steady even as exhaustion pressed on her shoulders. Caleb's heartbeat was unstable, surging, dropping, fighting its way back like someone who wasn't ready to leave the world just yet. She adjusted the IV, checked his vitals, whispered calm instructions to the team. But something about him kept pulling her attention back. It wasn't pity. It was something quieter, a feeling she couldn't name. Around 3 a.m., when the hallway had finally gone silent, she pulled a chair beside his bed. For a moment, she just watched him breathe, uneven, fragile, human. He looked nothing like the powerful man he'd later reveal himself to be. Here, he was simply a life she was trying to keep from slipping away. Then his fingers twitched, his brow tightened, and with a hoarse, frightened breath, he whispered again, barely audible, "Don't go, please don't go." Emily froze. Patients talked in their sleep all the time. But this felt different, like he wasn't calling a nurse, he was calling someone he'd lost. She placed her hand over his, steady, warm, grounding him through the storm. And for the rest of the night, whenever the monitors spiked or his breathing shook, he calmed only when her voice reached him, as if, without knowing her at all, some part of him already trusted her. 3. The connection. Caleb was discharged 2 days later, but Emily felt his absence long before the paperwork was signed. The room he'd occupied seemed too still, as if the air itself remembered the sound of his uneven breathing. She told herself it was normal, patients leave, lives move on, but her thoughts kept circling back to the way he whispered, "Don't go," even in unconscious fear. So when she walked into the lobby during her lunch break and saw him sitting there, no appointment, no bandages needing replacement, just him, her breath caught a little. He stood up too quickly, as if he'd been rehearsing the moment she might look his way. "I had a follow-up," he said, holding a cup of coffee awkwardly, like he wasn't used to offering anyone anything. But the chart in his hand was blank, and his eyes gave him away. He wasn't here for medicine. He was here for presence, hers. Their conversation started small, how he was feeling, if he'd been sleeping, whether the dizziness had faded. But slowly, subtly, the space between them shifted. He asked about her shifts, her favorite coffee, what music she played on late nights when the hospital was too quiet. And Emily, cautious but curious, found herself answering, piece by piece, softness returning like something she'd forgotten she still had. One afternoon, she was adjusting the dressing on his shoulder when he said quietly, "You make the noise in my head slow down." Her hands paused. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even flirtation. It was honesty, the kind that slips out before someone can build walls around it. And that was the beginning of something neither of them said aloud, but both of them felt. A connection built not on grand gestures, but on quiet moments where two lonely lives finally found someone who made the world feel a little less heavy. 4. The breaking point. The shift came quietly, so quietly Emily almost missed it. 1 week, Caleb was showing up with coffee and shy questions about her day. The next, he was harder to reach. answering texts hours late, his voice clipped and distant when he did call back. She told herself he was busy, that CEOs lived in constant storms, but deep down, she felt the temperature change long before he admitted anything was wrong. It wasn't until the night she found him sitting alone in his car outside the hospital that she understood how bad it had gotten. His hands were dug into the steering wheel, his breath sharp and uneven, like someone trying to hold the world together with nothing but willpower. When she tapped on the window, he flinched, not at her touch, but at the vulnerability of being seen like this. "Caleb, talk to me," she whispered. For a moment, he looked at her with something raw, almost pleading, but then the mask slid back into place. He got out of the car, slammed the door harder than he meant to, and said, "There's nothing to talk about." She followed him to the sidewalk. "You don't have to go through this alone." That was when he snapped, not in anger, but in fear disguised as coldness. "I don't need saving, not from you." The words hit harder than he realized. Emily stepped back, stunned, the echo of his voice cracking something inside her. He saw it, just for a second, and something in his eyes softened with regret. But instead of reaching for her, he took another step away, a deliberate, self-protective retreat. She watched him walk off into the night, shoulders stiff, movements restless, like a man running from a fire only he could see. And for the first time, Emily understood the truth. Caleb wasn't pushing her away because he didn't care. He was pushing her away because he cared more than he knew how to handle. But knowing that didn't make the breaking hurt any less. 5. The silence. The silence didn't arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a curtain being lowered between them. First, Caleb took a little longer to text back. Then the calls stopped coming. Then the read receipts appeared without a single reply. Emily kept telling herself it was temporary, that he just needed space, but space has a way of turning into distance. And distance has a way of turning into absence. She still checked the hospital lobby during lunch, half expecting to see him with that careful smile he wore when he didn't know how to say he'd missed her. She checked her phone before every shift, reread old messages, tried to trace the exact moment where everything began slipping through her fingers. But the truth was simpler and crueler. She wasn't losing him. He was letting go. Nights became the hardest. The quiet in her apartment felt louder than any ambulance siren. She found herself pausing in the doorway, hoping, irrationally, that maybe he would be there, leaning against the wall the way he used to wait for her after late shifts.
I just disappeared.
But every room was empty. Every hope dissolved into the same soft ache. Still, Emily didn't break. She moved through her days with the quiet, practiced strength of someone who had survived loss before. She checked charts, helped patients, forced her hands to be steady even when her heart wasn't. Because life didn't stop for heartbreak, it just pressed forward, expecting her to follow. And in the growing silence between them, she realized something she'd never allowed herself to admit. She had been pouring her whole heart into someone who didn't know how to hold it. Not because he didn't care, but because fear had taken the place where love was supposed to live. That understanding didn't make the nights less empty. But it did make her feel, for the first time, like she might someday learn to fill them again. 6. The return. Caleb returned without warning, no message, no call, just the soft echo of footsteps in the hospital hallway as Emily finished her shift. She looked up and there he was, standing under the fluorescent lights like someone who had spent months carrying a weight he finally couldn't bear alone. His hair was longer, eyes dimmer, shoulders lower. Regret clung to him like a second skin. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said her name, quiet, unsteady, like a man confessing and apologizing all at once. "Emily, I shouldn't have disappeared." She didn't rush toward him, didn't soften the silence for him like she once would have. Instead, she waited, steady, guarded, letting him feel the space he had created. He swallowed hard. You saved my life, and I didn't know how to let anyone save me twice. When things got dark, I ran. It's what I've always done. There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion, of fighting himself, of losing battles no one saw. Emily finally spoke. You could have told me. You didn't know me perfect, just honesty. Her words were gentle, but they landed like truth always does, clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. He nodded, eyes glistening with something close to shame. I know, and I'm not here to ask for anything. I just needed you to know I wasn't leaving because you weren't enough. I was leaving because I was terrified you were. For a moment, the world held still. Emily felt the old ache stir, but it didn't swallow her like before. She had changed. She had grown. The silence that once crushed her had become clarity. She stepped closer, not to reconcile, but to see him clearly, without the blur of hurt. Caleb, healing isn't something you run back to when the world gets heavy. It's something you choose, every day. He closed his eyes, a single exhale breaking through him. I'm choosing it now, he whispered, even if you don't choose me back. She didn't answer, not yet, because this time, her heart wasn't reacting, it was deciding. 7. The resolution. Caleb didn't ask for forgiveness. And Emily didn't offer it, not right away. They stood in the quiet corridor like two people finally seeing each other without the fog of fear or expectation. And strangely, that honesty felt softer than any apology could. He shifted, hands in his pockets, voice barely above a breath. I'm not here to win you back, Emily. I'm here to grow up, finally. She believed him, not because his words were perfect, but because his eyes no longer searched for a place to hide. For the first time, he wasn't running, he was standing still, letting himself be seen. Emily stepped back just enough to breathe clearly. I don't know what happens next, she admitted, but I know I'm not breaking myself to hold someone together anymore. If you want to be in my life, it has to be as someone who shows up. He nodded once, slow, understanding. I will, not for redemption, for responsibility. There was no dramatic embrace, no last-minute confession, just two people choosing truth over illusion. Emily felt something loosen inside her, not attachment, but release. The kind that comes from realizing she didn't lose herself trying to save him, and she never would again. Caleb took a step back, giving her space instead of taking it. Thank you, he said quietly, for saving my life, and for letting me learn how to save my own. She didn't reply with promises, only with a small, steady nod, an acknowledgement that healing was a path, not a moment, and whether their paths crossed again or drifted apart, she would walk hers with clarity, not fear. As the camera fades, let this be the reminder you carry. Sometimes we save someone's life, just long enough for them to learn how to stand without leaning on us. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose ourselves without closing our hearts. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. Send it to someone who needs it. Hit the like button, and subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more stories that stay with you long after they're over.